She worked double shifts for over a decade, scraping by on tips and burnt coffee, but Grace Mitchell never let life harden her heart. One rainy night, a shivering boy in a wheelchair appeared outside her diner, and what she did next would set off a chain of events no one could predict. The rain came down in thick, cold sheets that night, pounding against the cracked sidewalks of East Lexington Street, turning the gutters into rushing streams. The streetlights buzzed and flickered above, casting a tired yellow glow over the worn brick buildings that lined the block. Most of the city had already shut down. Only a few headlights cut through the storm as cars sped past, trying to outrun the weather. But the lights inside Frank's 24-hour diner still burned. It was just past 11 p.m., and the little bell over the front door had stopped ringing hours ago. The booths were empty, the grill was cold, and the scent of old grease and burnt toast hung in the air like a memory that wouldn't leave. Most nights, this would have been the moment Grace Mitchell hung up her apron and called it quits. But Grace wasn't like most people. At 47, Grace had worked in this same diner for nearly 12 years. Every day, 6 days a week, 2 shifts back to back. She'd show up before sunrise and leave long after the city forgot her. Rent inched higher every year. Groceries ate into what little was left, and her aging Buick rattled louder with each winter. But still, she showed up, rain or shine, her sneakers soaked and her back aching, because that's what life demanded of women like her. She never complained. She never asked for anything. And most importantly, she never stopped being kind. That night, as she wiped down the counters with her usual rhythm, slow circles with a rag that had seen better days, she noticed something unusual through the window. Just beyond the neon sign that blinked Frank's All Night Eats, a small figure sat still in the pouring rain. At first, she thought it was trash or a bundled blanket someone left behind. But then it shifted, moved. Grace squinted. It was a boy, maybe 9 or 10, hunched over in a beat-up wheelchair, soaked through to the bone. His dark hair clung to his forehead, and his tiny frame was wrapped in a coat that looked 2 winters too thin. He gripped a frayed gray blanket with trembling hands, trying and failing to keep warm. Grace dropped the rag. She pushed open the door and was hit with the full force of the storm. Wind clawed at her skin, and cold water splashed up her legs. But she didn't care. She walked straight to the boy and crouched beside him. "Hey, baby," she said gently, like she was approaching a scared animal. "What are you doing out here all by yourself?" The boy flinched at first, like he didn't expect anyone to see him. His eyes were wide, blue, piercing, and full of something that Grace recognized all too well. Fear. Not just from the cold, but from the world. "I'm waiting for my dad," he mumbled. His voice barely carried over the sound of the rain. Grace looked up and down the block. Nothing but the glow of a pawn shop across the street and a row of closed storefronts. Not a soul in sight. "Where is he now?" she asked, her voice soft but edged with concern. The boy shrugged, pulling the blanket tighter. Grace bit her lip. She'd seen this before. Kids waiting on people who weren't coming, and it never got easier. "You can't sit out here like this," she said, her tone firm but warm. "You'll catch your death in this mess. Come on inside, sweetheart. I've got heat, dry towels, and something hot to eat." The boy hesitated, then gave a slow, uncertain nod. Without asking further, Grace wheeled him inside, careful not to jolt him on the uneven sidewalk. The diner's warmth hit them both like a wave. The smell of coffee, onions, and the last grilled cheese of the night still lingered. Grace guided him to a booth near the radiator, grabbed a clean towel from behind the counter, and draped it over his shoulders. She knelt to his level, smiled through the exhaustion, and said, "I'm Grace." "What's your name, honey?" "Lucas," he whispered. "That's a strong name," she said, nodding. "You hungry?" He looked like he hadn't eaten in days. Grace didn't wait for an answer. She turned on the griddle, sliced up the last loaf of sourdough, and got to work, just like she'd done every day for over a decade. But this time, something was different. Something was coming. something that neither of them could see yet. And it had already begun the moment she opened that door. Lucas sat quietly in the corner booth, his tiny frame still trembling beneath the towel Grace had wrapped around his shoulders. The radiator hummed softly beside him, slowly pushing back the chill that had sunk deep into his bones. He clutched the edges of the blanket she'd given him, still damp but warmer now, his knuckles pale against the faded fabric. Grace moved around the kitchen with the kind of ease only years of repetition could bring. She buttered 2 slices of sourdough, slid them onto the grill, and dropped a ladle of tomato soup into a pot to warm. It wasn't much, but it was something that came from a place of comfort. Her grandmother's recipe, the kind that made cold nights a little less cruel. As the scent of melting cheese filled the diner, Lucas's eyes followed her every move. He didn't say a word, but the way his shoulders dropped ever so slightly said enough. He was starting to feel safe. A few minutes later, Grace placed the steaming plate in front of him, a grilled cheese sandwich perfectly golden, with a bowl of tomato soup on the side. She even folded a paper napkin and tucked it into his lap like he was royalty. "This one's on me, sugar," she said, her voice light but warm. "Eat while it's hot." Lucas stared at the food like it might disappear. Then slowly he picked up a half of the sandwich and took a bite. The cheese stretched in long, gooey strings, and the look that crossed his face made Grace's chest ache. Wonder. Real, pure wonder. Like he'd never had anything that good before. "This is the best thing I've ever eaten," he whispered, his voice full of quiet awe. Grace chuckled, sliding into the seat across from him. "Good food fixes a lot of things," she said. "Not everything, but a lot." Lucas nodded as he took another bite, his feet swinging under the table. The diner lights flickered a little, but inside it felt like the safest place in the world. For a moment, Grace let herself believe that this night, despite the rain, might end peacefully. She was wrong. Across the street, a sleek black Cadillac Escalade sat idle beneath the flickering light of a pawn shop sign. Inside, Henry Caldwell watched every move through the rain-specked windshield, his jaw clenched, his expression unreadable. At 52, Henry was the kind of man who didn't believe in chance encounters. He was calculated, cold, and everything in his life ran like clockwork. His company, his investments, even his family. But tonight, things had not gone according to plan. Lucas was supposed to wait 5 minutes, 10 at most, but business had pulled Henry into a call with investors in Tokyo. 28 minutes later, when he looked out the window and saw his son being pushed into a greasy diner by a stranger, he'd nearly lost his composure. But then he saw the woman, a black waitress, maybe late 40s, in a cheap apron and worn-out shoes, feeding his son, wiping the soup from his chin with the gentleness of someone who didn't see a burden, just a boy who needed a warm meal. It rattled something in him. She didn't know who Lucas was. She didn't know who he was. And still, she'd helped, not with hesitation, not with suspicion, but with the kind of natural kindness that couldn't be faked. Henry reached for his phone. "Nora," he said, his voice low and clipped when his assistant answered. "I need you at Lexington Diner. No suit, no heels. 20 minutes. "Sir?" she asked. "Find out everything about the woman who just fed my son." Then he hung up. Inside the diner, Lucas laughed, a sound so small, so unguarded, that it made Grace pause mid-sip. She smiled and leaned over to wipe a bit of soup off his chin again. "Messy eater," she teased. Lucas giggled. "Sorry." And somewhere across the street, hidden in shadows and rain, Henry Caldwell made a decision, the kind that could shift the course of multiple lives. Because for a man who didn't believe in kindness, he now found himself in debt to it. The rain hadn't let up, drumming harder now against the windshield of the black Cadillac Escalade parked across the street. Inside, Henry Caldwell sat motionless in the driver's seat, his fingers steepled under his chin, his sharp gray eyes fixed on the warm glow of the diner. He hadn't intended to stay this long. The meeting with his Tokyo investors had run over. Urgent restructuring, potential mergers. The kind of high-stakes conversations that men like him were used to. He'd told Lucas to wait outside the diner, just until he wrapped the call. 5 minutes, he'd said. 10, tops. It had been 32. And now there was his son, inside a rundown diner, seated across from a stranger, a woman in a faded apron, with a smile that didn't look forced or rehearsed. She wasn't just feeding him, she was seeing him. And Henry didn't know how to process that. In his world, kindness always came with strings, deals, incentives, leverage. But this woman hadn't asked for a name, hadn't reached for her phone to call the police. She'd simply opened the door, brought Lucas in, and treated him like he mattered. It unnerved him. Grace Mitchell wasn't part of the equation, not part of any network he knew, not a name that showed up on social registries, nonprofit boards, or high-end school committees. And yet in that moment, she held more of his son's attention than he ever had. Henry's phone buzzed on the center console. He picked it up, his voice low and clipped. "Nora." "Yes, sir." "I need eyes on someone," he said, watching as Grace refilled Lucas's soup without being asked. "Lexington Diner. She's wearing a green apron. Early 40s, maybe late. African American. Get me her full name, employment history, anything on record. Discreetly." There was a beat of silence. "You want background checks?" "I want everything," Henry replied, his tone leaving no room for interpretation. "Address, financials, social media, family if applicable." Nora hesitated. "Should I come down there?" "No suit, no heels. Dress like a local. You'll stand out otherwise." "Yes, sir." He hung up without another word. Back inside the diner, Lucas was talking now. Really talking, his small hands gesturing mid-air as he described something that made him laugh. Henry couldn't hear what it was, but he didn't need to. The way Grace leaned in, nodding along, her eyes focused only on the boy in front of her, that was enough. Henry exhaled slowly, his breath fogging the glass. There was something deeply unsettling about what he was watching. Not because it was dangerous, not because it was inappropriate, but because it was genuine. That was the part he couldn't understand. All his life, Henry had been surrounded by people who performed kindness, who played empathy. His board members smiled when the cameras were on. Philanthropists cut checks when the headlines called for it. But Grace? She wasn't posturing. She wasn't angling for anything. She had just seen a kid in need and done something about it. And now she had his son smiling, laughing, something Henry hadn't seen since his wife passed 3 years ago. That night had changed everything. Broken routines turned structure into chaos. And despite Henry's wealth, his power, and his ruthless grip on control, he couldn't fix Lucas, couldn't buy what had been taken from him, his sense of safety, his trust. But here was this woman in a diner that probably made less in a week than Henry spent on wine in a night, managing to reach his son in a way no therapist, tutor, or specialist had been able to. And that terrified him more than he could say. So he stayed in that SUV, watching through the rain-streaked windshield, as if the answers he'd been chasing for years sat in that booth, wrapped in a blanket, dipping grilled cheese into soup. Because maybe, just maybe, this wasn't about business anymore. Maybe it never had been. The rain had finally stopped by the time Grace got home, her sneakers squished with every step as she climbed the 3 flights of stairs to her apartment. The building on West Fayette Street had seen better decades. Paint peeling, lights flickering, the heater barely managing a low hum even in the dead of winter. She unlocked the door to her 1-bedroom unit, tossed her soaked apron on a hook by the kitchen, and leaned against the frame with a long sigh. The warmth from the diner was gone now. All that remained was the weight of exhaustion and a pocket full of small bills and loose change. $42.75 in tips after 12 hours on her feet. But her mind wasn't on money. It was still with that boy, Lucas, and the look in his eyes when he finally felt safe. There was something about him that tugged at her, the way he flinched at kindness, like he didn't know what to do with it, the way he smiled at grilled cheese like it was a gift from heaven, And the woman who came to get him, something about her had been off. Too polished for that part of town, too rehearsed in her words. "I'm his aunt," she had said with that easy confidence Grace had learned to distrust. Lucas hadn't corrected her, but he hadn't confirmed it either. Grace had been around long enough to recognize power when it showed up pretending to be invisible. She was just kicking off her wet socks when a knock sounded at the door. 3 slow, deliberate taps. Her body tensed. No one came by at this hour, not without calling first. She crossed the small living room, peeked through the peephole, and felt her stomach flip. A man in a black coat. Tall, clean-cut, shoes too perfect for Baltimore's broken sidewalks. She didn't open the door. "Who is it?" There was a pause. Then a deep voice, smooth and measured. "Henry Caldwell." The name meant nothing to her. "What do you want?" "To talk." Her gut said no, but something in her chest. It wasn't curiosity exactly. It was instinct. So she slid the chain loose, opened the door a few inches, and got a full look at him. He didn't belong there. Not in her building, not in her life. But she recognized him now, from across the street, the SUV, the eyes. "You're Lucas's father," she said slowly. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "I was watching from my car last night." Grace crossed her arms, her voice firm. "You were watching your kid from the damn street while he sat out there in the rain?" Henry didn't flinch. "I made a mistake, and I don't intend to make another one." Without waiting for permission, he stepped forward and placed a thick, sealed envelope on her small kitchen table. The kind of envelope that came from boardrooms and legal offices. Heavy paper, bold lettering, the kind that practically shouted money before you ever opened it. Grace stared at it, then at him. "What is that?" "A job offer." She blinked. "Excuse me?" "Full-time, 6 figures, health coverage, pension. You'd work for me directly. Public relations, outreach, community affairs. You're good with people. That's hard to teach." She laughed once, bitter and sharp. "You think I want to work for some billionaire who leaves his kid in the rain and thinks handing out a paycheck makes everything square?" Henry's expression didn't change. "I don't think you want charity, Ms. Mitchell. That's why I'm not offering it." The way he said her name made her spine stiffen. Calm, cold, like he had read every page of her life before knocking on that door. "You don't know me," she said quietly. "I know enough," he replied. "I know you didn't ask who Lucas was. I know you fed him, comforted him, and treated him like a child, not a burden. And I know that's rare." Grace glanced at the envelope again. She didn't move. "And what exactly would I be doing? Making coffee for board meetings?" His lips twitched, almost a smile. You'd be negotiating contracts, managing corporate partnerships, running programs that matter. I don't need Ivy League suits who say the right things. I need someone who sees people." She didn't answer. Not yet, but the envelope stayed on the table. Heavy, real, and for the first time in a very long time, so was the opportunity. Grace Mitchell's first day at Caldwell Enterprises felt like walking into another universe. The building itself was all glass and marble. Polished floors that clicked under every heel, high ceilings that made you feel small, and an air that smelled faintly of eucalyptus and money. She stepped through the revolving doors in her best thrift store blazer and $39 pumps, shoulders squared, head held high. And every pair of eyes in that lobby turned to look. Not with curiosity, not with welcome, with calculation. She wasn't what they expected. A middle-aged black woman with no MBA, no prep school credentials, no LinkedIn full of Ivy League buzzwords. Just a long resume of night shifts, diner grease, and lived experience. But Grace had walked into tougher rooms. She'd served men like these coffee and watched them ignore her like she didn't exist. Now they had to see her. Henry met her in the executive wing, an entire floor that felt like a private museum. He didn't say much, just gestured to a sleek office with a view of downtown and said, "It's yours." The desk was spotless. The chair felt like it cost more than her month's rent. On the wall hung a massive framed photo of Henry shaking hands with foreign diplomats, flanked by white men in tailored suits. No women, no people of color, no one like her. She barely had time to settle in before Nora Winters walked in. Same woman from the diner, now in a navy pantsuit, tablet in hand, eyes sharp. "Ms. Mitchell," she said coolly, not offering a handshake. "Welcome to Caldwell. I've prepared a folder with protocol expectations, dress code, conduct, media training. Henry asked that I loop you in." Grace nodded. "Thanks, I'll read it." Nora hesitated. "If you have questions, ask me. Just keep in mind this place moves fast." Grace smiled just enough to show she understood the subtext. "Stay in line. Don't ask for too much. Don't make waves." "I move fast too," she replied. But the message was clear. This world wasn't built for her, and no one here was planning to make space. Still, Grace got to work. She sat in on meetings, took notes, learned the internal politics. She watched how the executives, almost all white, mostly male, spoke over younger employees, dismissed community feedback, and treated PR like a cleanup tool, not a strategy. She listened more than she talked, and when she did speak, the room always got a little too quiet. She saw it in their posture, the way some shifted uncomfortably when she questioned projections, or how their eyes flicked toward Henry like they needed permission to respond. They weren't used to someone like her having a voice that counted. The moment of reckoning came 2 weeks in, during a boardroom negotiation with Langston Medical, a major investor threatening to pull funding unless Caldwell outsourced production to reduce labor costs. The proposal would eliminate over 1,500 domestic jobs, mostly black and brown workers from Baltimore's east and west sides. The room was full, 12 white executives, 1 black woman. Grace. She looked around the table as one suit after another rationalized the plan. "It's not personal, just business. Margins are too tight. They'll land on their feet." When it was her turn, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I grew up 3 blocks from the factory this plan would shut down," she said. "My cousin still works there. She's a single mom with 2 kids. You think she'll land on her feet? Or is she just a line in your spreadsheet?" Silence. One executive chuckled under his breath. "We're not here to talk feelings." Grace leaned forward. "No, we're here to talk reputation. And I promise you, when the news breaks that Caldwell cut American jobs in Baltimore while expanding in Taiwan, the community backlash will cost more than you think." She slid a folder across the table, a community impact report she'd compiled herself. Statistics, testimonials, media angles, legal vulnerabilities. Henry didn't say a word, just watched. And when the vote came down, the room shifted. The outsourcing proposal was shelved. She walked out without a word, but everyone in that room knew. Grace Mitchell wasn't just a diversity hire. She was a force. It happened on a Tuesday. Grace had just returned from a lunch meeting with a local nonprofit, an initiative she'd spearheaded to funnel more corporate funds into underserved Baltimore schools. She felt good. Real good. Progress was slow, but it was real. Was